All right, Sven, we're back
Oh,
for another round. I have to say that this will have to become a recurring with you because there's so many things we have been talking about and that we can talk about. Honestly, I think the world's changing speed is giving Netflix producers so much stress because unfortunately, right, it's changing so fast that nobody's able to be catching up. Now, you just landed in Japan. Japan is one of the most impacted from an energy perspective.
yes.
I assume that it's still very fresh in terms of your perception. Maybe just a few quick words about, you've been to Japan many times. Just a few quick words about your latest fresh impression of Japan before we move to the center of the world, that is the Strait of Hormuz.
Yes. Well, I think and indeed, I've been in Japan many, many times. I do not consider myself a Japan expert, but I've been here many times and I talk to the people, of course. I mean, depends the ones who speak English, which is not so often in Japan. They don't speak English that much. But Japanese, of course, always this very sense of, if I may, very blunt, superiority. They think it's still better than the rest of the world. Often I talk about European products and they say, well, this might be made in Germany, but it's still not made in Japan. The mentality, we're still number one in the world, right? That's one of the things. But I do think that also over the last years, when I talk to my, let's say, business partners here, people I know, they do start to say that a lot of Japanese, things also start to the structure is not that healthy anymore and the quality is not what it used to be, and they all start to lose the innovation game, and they start to realize they're running behind, for instance, against China in so many ways. And my trip this time will be 3 days, so I'll just landed actually now in Tokyo near the railway station. So we'll see tomorrow and day after tomorrow. I tend to ask them questions about also how they look at Iran and Takaishi, the new prime minister, and the way they take Japan and everything. But I think there's economically, Japan is not doing very well. Obviously, I think that will be a major topic. So let me sense a bit how it goes over the next days here. But I tend to think that people will be complaining a bit about economical situation. They will complain about Trump, and of course, obviously, Japan is now all in with Trump, right? They going to invest, $100 billion in America, of course, on demand of Trump. And I don't think a lot of Japanese are really happy with that because they do know he's a mafia boss, obviously. So I tend to see how they talk about that. Let's see about that, basically. Let's see about that.
And anyhow, as we mentioned on this, note of peace, if we switch back quickly to the latest situation in Strait of Hormuz, I'm pretty sure that you have been watching very closely, and I've just finished a call with some business people in the region as well. People are, we previously talked about it, that, sometimes maybe the most important moment we should be paying attention to certain matters is the moment we are kind of past our own news cycle, right?
Yes.
So what's happening? What is the latest? How should we be thinking about this affair of Trump, Iran, Strait of Hormuz anymore? What's your latest take?
Well, it's clear that he took a massive gamble, convinced by Netanyahu, of course, went horribly wrong. And now, of course, they say, okay, let's have some negotiations to come to a kind of a peace agreement. Of course, Iranians said, okay, we want to take control of the Strait of Hormuz. The military bases has to go on. We need compensation for the damage. The Americans, of course, say you cannot have nuclear weapons anymore. The Strait of Hormuz has to be free. These two positions are miles away from each other, and of course, that's of course the first round of negotiations. That's why the reason why, of course, they can't come to agreement, and it will take much longer. In my opinion, what's happening now that the war will go on somehow for sure. And of course, Trump is going to now put a blockade on a blockade, right? Blockade the blockade. But eventually, Iran is not going to talk about denuclearization. They're not going to talk about we give the Hormuz, we give it up. Finish. That conversation is gone. That ship has sailed. The world has to go to accept that the Strait of Hormuz is going to be under control, and these guys will have nuclear weapons. That thing has changed. By the way, I always say 1956, Suez Canal crisis, right? I mean, Nasser said, okay, now it's ours. And until this very day, everybody needs to pay when you pass the Suez Canal. So it's not, there's a precedent in world history that the thing happened before. I mean, of course, it's a massive strategic defeat for America. They will never be able to accept this. It's a massive political defeat for Trump. But this thing is irreversible. It will happen. It's never going to change. So what you see now, of course, is a continuation of the war, and it's going to get worse, but before it gets better. But Iran, is having the upper hand, and obviously they will control the Strait of Hormuz, and they will also build a nuclear weapon sooner or later. That is going to happen. No way Trump is going to change this. That I'm quite sure of. And now, of course, he said, okay, let's put a blockade on blockade. How is that going to work? First of all, he has to put his ships closer to the coast, and then you become very vulnerable, of course, for Iranian attacks. I mean, secondly, what are you going to do? You're going to shoot at Chinese ships who go and get through? I mean, that's going to be a massive problem with Chinese and other countries, of course, who says, well, it's freedom of seas.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is not going to be so easy at all. And now you see already that UK and Spain and of course Russia, China, and other countries also, but many European countries have always already condemned this blockade of the blockade. So even his own allies are against it. So he makes a bad situation worse. This is not going to be that's the big problem, right? He makes a bad situation worse. There are no good options. The only good option is say, let's have sincere talks to find a long-standing peace and agreement where we can live together. But of course, there's no way in hell that Netanyahu wants to do that. And of course, Americans also know this very moment because they still have the idea we're winning this war somehow. So no, this is going to be very, very bad before it gets better for sure. I am 100% sure of that.
How long do you think? And by the way, I just want to make a remark that it is really the right moment for the historians like yourself to shine because every person wakes up thinking, including myself, that my God, like here's another thing finally the world has never seen.
Yes.
But actually, if you learn history and not that even long history, you know that this thing is not that new after all. And you see a lot of different patterns that you just mentioned about the Canal of Suez.
Yes.
But if I ask you to take a crystal ball of a historian, how long would it take, in your view, even in this standard case, as you say, Iranians are going to put a toll booth? How long are we going to reach that stability, that stable situation where, okay, granted, they're going to take a toll, but somehow things are back on track?
Well, the whole situation can last, let's say, a kind of a state of war. Attacks on and off could happen for months because they will have some attacks and have some peace negotiations and attacks again. That's going to go on for months for sure. But even if they come to some kind of a modus vivendi agreement after, let's say, a few months, because of course the world economy goes down the drain, and that of course is very bad for Trump. The Iranians will can stand the pain. They say we don't care. It's this for us. It's existential, so we just keep on doing it. We don't care.
Yeah.
Of course, Americans can't stand that. Eventually, despite Trump saying, "Oh, we have enough oil," the world cannot stand that. Japan going to call Trump. Europeans going to call. Everybody's going to call Trump. Solve this thing as soon as possible. That's very clear. But then what you're going to see, that the Americans have to accept somehow defeat, but this is going to last years and years and years, that the Americans will not accept this, in fact, although de facto it becomes a fact, but they will not accept it for a very long time. So you will always have, for the next years to come, I would say even probably 5, maybe a decade even, you will see that there's going to be trouble between America and Iran. And of course, Israel is the third player, wants to keep the war going. But this thing is not solved so quickly. Even if it becomes relatively stable, they're going to be always struggles for the next decade. That's this such a huge defeat for a superpower is not going to They can't accept it. And I remind you that, let's say in the Vietnam War in 1968, the Americans knew already they were losing. The Pentagon Papers showed that. There was the famous Tet Offensive then. And a peace was only signed in 1972. So it took them still 4 years. They kept on fighting on, but they knew they couldn't win this anymore. And remember also, they won every single battle but lost the war, right? So this could be a situation where Americans could keep on bombing, but that doesn't mean they're going to win the war. That's not going to happen here. So there are many situations, of course, where de facto they have to accept a certain situation, but they don't want to, and then they will do everything to go against that and keep it going as long as possible. That's for sure. So no, this can last literally. That let's say America really accepts the current situation with Iran. That could take. There's only 5 years from now going to be really, really accepted. I'd say in their minds. Maybe they have to accept it on paper, but they still will do a lot. They will still do everything to change the game. They're basically quite sure about it. Pushed on by Israel, I would say.
Wow, thanks for this very clear picture you're painting. Unfortunately, very I want to say somewhere between depressing and very devastating picture. Because if you think about anywhere between the layman, really people's lives, to business operators, to all the business around the world, it is going to be insanely disrupted from
Yes.
the oil price to start with, but all the raw inputs, right? So much inputs are coming from the petrochemical industry.
Yes.
And to the company's supply chains. In supply chain is a very code word, but
Yes.
ultimately is all these companies that are supplying products wherever you live around the world that they keeps your life going. But their supply chain today, as you said about the economy going down, the supply chain of the of pre 2006, 2026 has definitely gone down the drain.
Yeah, for sure.
Right?
Any Western company now or any company in the world is not thinking about rethinking its supply chains and finding alternative sources, they're going to be finished. They're going to be in huge trouble. I mean, you see that coming already. First, it's the oil and the gas,
Mhm.
of course, but then
Mhm.
it's going to be the food because a lot of this fertilizer comes from that region. And now China, I think 2 days ago, they announced they will stop exporting sulfur acids, which of course is
Mhm.
huge ingredient for fertilizers also. And China is obviously preparing for a long-term war. They don't not going to be involved, but they know, this could get out of hand here. Let's stop export, let's keep it in our own country, basically. And we give it only to the
Mhm.
other countries which are friends of us, or we want to give it, like
Mhm.
help them a bit, but that's not going to be Europe so
Mhm.
easily, and definitely not the
Yeah.
Americans. Maybe for us leverage, but they give it to other countries. And you see that China is preparing for that. If you're now a European or American company and you're not start to think about, okay, where should I maybe find other places to find these kind of fertilizers or sulfuric acids, which is part also of the petrochemical industry, no, they're going to be in huge trouble. So to me, the mesmerizing part is that I think in the Western world, to be honest, in America and Europe, many companies are not preparing for that. They somehow seem to think that this thing will be over in a few weeks still. Yes, it's going to be
Mhm.
bad, but it's going to be over. And yes, there's
Mhm.
going to be some oil crisis, but nothing more than that. Or maybe
Mhm.
recession. No, this is going to be much, much worse for sure. It's already
Mhm.
coming. It's just people don't realize it yet.
Yeah, yeah. Now
Unfortunately.
you just unfortunately, yeah. I've been writing about this in my Substack. As you know, I run a industrial intelligence company, and I'm sure that we'll have chance to get back to this topic. Before we wrap up the session today, because I'm sure we're going to have you back real soon, you touch upon the Vietnam War.
Mm.
What do you make of To Lam, the Vietnam leader's visit to China recently?
Well, yeah, it's an interesting thing. Although that Vietnam and China are both communist countries, so supposed to be more aligned politically, they're quite not aligned. The Vietnamese do not like the Chinese a lot, to be really
Hmm.
honest. And the
Hmm.
Chinese, of course, they invest now a lot in Vietnam and build their factories, but of course there are some troubles there. I would say
Hmm.
the same thing. The Vietnamese are quite close to the Americans in many ways, in fact, despite the war
Hmm.
what happened over there. I think
Hmm.
this is a direct effect of the Iran war that Vietnam was also saying, look, in our neighborhood, they're close to China, of course. We have to get well with China now. We have to get better ties. I think that's the real direct consequence of this. Economically, of course, China is much more important than Vietnam for them, and I think
Hmm.
that's what now all of a sudden, of course, the Vietnamese start to realize. So I think in
Hmm.
the whole neighborhood of China, you see
Hmm.
South Korea getting close to China now. You see start to
Hmm.
talk to North Korea again. You see now that Taiwan, the leader of the Nationalist Party we discussed, is coming to China, which
Hmm.
maybe it's not maybe not direct effect, but has to do with the Iran war also. You
Hmm.
see that the Philippines is getting now start to talk with China again about energy and about trying to
Hmm.
maybe have joint energy projects to drill gas and oil in the South Chinese Sea. Remember, the Chinese Coast Patrol Guard often clashes with the Philippines. So, that's a bad history. They're coming together now.
Hmm.
Vietnam is now also getting closer to China. So all these countries closer to China, they are all now turning closer. I mean, not completely to China, but you see clearly that they know, we can't rely on the Americans. They're far off. We have to go to China now. That's very the
Hmm.
case. Of course, there's one huge exception, and as a country right now, Japan, they go the opposite direction, which of course is
Hmm.
complete insanity in my opinion. But that's a
Hmm.
completely other story. So yeah, I
Hmm.
mean, one of the direct effects is I would say that there was this pivot to Asia from the United States supposed to be under Barack Obama. That pivot
Hmm.
never happened because there are no more military personnel, no more soldiers, American soldiers in Asia, this part
Hmm.
of Asia than 10 years ago. Paid any more diplomatic visits than before. They put not in more economical resources. By the way, Americans did not sign the big trans-Pacific agreement, free trade agreement with big part of Southeast Asia and Asia and America. It was killed by Trump, by the way. And of course, the Chinese put in the RCEP, which is another huge free trade agreement. So of course, all these countries went to China, not to the US. So, they talk about pivot to Asia. First of all, it didn't happen. Secondly, pivot away now because all the military stuff goes to Iran from South Korea and stuff. It's just insanity from the Americans. All these countries are saying, Jesus, we have to live with China now. We have to work much closer. That's obviously what's happening in this part of the world.
Hey guys, thank you so much for spending time with us. If you enjoy some of the insights here, it would mean so much to us if you can hit the subscribe button wherever you're listening to this podcast. And if you enjoy also Sven's insights a lot, make sure you go to YouTube channel, Bridge space Geo, and subscribe to Sven's unique insights. And I personally look forward to have so much more insights together with you guys. See you guys around. Yeah. Before we wrap the session, since you're talking about getting closer to China, do you not see other exceptions rather than Spain? Or should I ask you, what do you make of Spain and Spain's leadership? Yeah. What is on the surface? What is beneath the surface?
Yeah, so the Spanish Prime Minister Sanchez, he visited, is now in China, 4-day visit. And this is a 4th visit in 4 years, which actually tells you a lot about the focus that they have now in China. And, where Europe is always talking about strategic autonomy and, we have to balance between, rebalance between the US and China. In fact, European countries say, but they talk the talk, don't walk the walk, right? Of course, very much committed to the transatlantic relationship. They all went to China, Merz and Macron and Starmer, and they talk about bad relations, but they don't act actually because there's still a fear of China, security concerns, this and that. And Spain is taking the lead here and saying, we have to work closer with China. And I would say that now Orban is out in Hungary. And of course, he was best friend of China in Hungary, of course, in Europe. Now, maybe it's going to be Sanchez. He's not as extreme as Orban for sure, but he's going to be probably a good friend of China, I would say also. I think that Sanchez realizes that, they have to rebalance and they have to do it with China. And also because I think their position is quite interesting in Europe. So not only do they have historical economical ties with Latin America, and where the Chinese, of course, heavily active, and they work very well with China and Latin America. So Spain is a good ground for that. But at the same time, China is also investing a lot energy projects and all kind of logistics hubs in North Africa. Of course, is also very good for Spain because that also gives an economic opportunity. So they're well positioned to actually work well with China. So that I think is the reason why they are now in the front runners. And I also heard, I'm not sure, I also heard that the CIA, in fact, or the Americans, they tried to torpedo, or they were spying on Spain, and they tried to torpedo their relationship with China, of course. And I think they're quite angry about it also, that they will be hurt in their independence and stuff. So that's why I think they're shifting now much more towards China. For the record, they always have a top priority working with the European Union, but they obviously are now trying to really, as the first European country, really try to rebalance between China and the United States. They're actively working on that. And of course,
how much do you...
Europe wants to do a green transition. They want to have more digital infrastructure, this and that. And also for automotive, all of batteries, of course, they need batteries for the EVs. And these are the 3 aspects where China is have really good technologies, and where Europe is structurally completely dependent on China. They don't have it, and it takes them years to get it. So it's a clear synergy where China and Europe can work very well together. But Europe is still very much afraid, and they don't want to do it. And when the Chinese invest in Europe, there are going to be certain restrictions. You have to leave some technology behind. You have to create value. You have to create jobs and joint ventures, all these kind of things. And this, of course, is a playbook, is a copy from the Chinese playbook, of course, right? But exactly the same thing. So Europe is really in need of Chinese technology because China dominates in clean tech, especially in batteries, and still they're very reluctant to work with China. And there's a kind of a contradiction, of course. I think the most beautiful part is that they still criticize China a lot for forced tech transfers, but now Europe is going to do exactly the same. So they do criticize China for doing it, but Europe will do exactly the same. And there is one word for such a thing, it's called hypocrisy. That's the whole story here, of course.
Rightful in on quote, obviously, note. Thank you, Sven. I think this is a fantastic chat, and let's do another round when you will have had your more in-depth understanding of what's happening in Japan.
Yes, I'll have 2 days good conversation. I will learn a lot. Of course, at the end of the day, you can't learn everything. Of course, you just have to talk to a certain amount of people, and it's a certain category or certain class, so it's not always It's not you can talk to everybody, right, about everything. That makes sense. But you got at least an indication.
Sure, for sure.
Okay.
Absolutely. All right.
Thank you.
See you next round, Sven.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.